I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild Audio Podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it. This spring, the inaugural WCS-curated Real Wild New York Film Festival comes to Manhattan. Taking place on April 4th and 5th, this two-day event showcases award-winning natural history films and offers a unique chance to hear directly from the filmmakers and experts behind the stories. In the first of a three-part series on the festival, we look at one of those films, the 2022 Oscar-nominated documentary Haulout, which explores the impact of climate change on walrus habitat in the Arctic. Nat Moss has the story.
The hut on the desolate beach looks out on the Chukchi Sea across the Bering Strait from Alaska. To get there requires an arduous journey by plane, helicopter, and boat. It's on this isolated stretch that the film unfurls as a solitary figure walks along the beach.
You don't know who Maxime is when you first start. You think maybe he's a soldier. Has he deserted? You don't know where you are. There's the shipwrecks on the coast. Unless you're familiar with walrus haulouts, you don't even know what the title means.
Natalie Cash is executive producer for video production at WCS and one of the organizers of the Real Wild New York Film Festival. She describes how the film captured the imagination of filmgoers when it was first released in 2022, earning prestigious awards from the International Documentary Association and the American Film Institute on its way to an eventual Oscar nomination.
It checked every single box, whether it was, the impact it made, the editing, the sound, the cinematography. It just was at the top of every category.
The impact of the film rests in its exploration of how melting sea ice in the face of climate change is upending the habitat of walrus in the Arctic. Unable to rest on ice, the walrus are forced to haul out onto the beach, often hundreds of kilometers from the nearest mollusk-rich waters that they feed on. The particular cluster of walrus in the film is the subject of ongoing research by scientist Maxim Chakalev. What Maxim is documenting is extraordinary, says conservationist Martin Robards, the Arctic Beringia Regional Director for WCS.
These are astronomical haulouts. What you see there with the 90,000 to 100,000 walruses, that could well be half the population of walruses on the planet. That is a massive aggregation of wildlife.
It's the breathtaking size of this haulout that gives the film its title and one of the most surprising and unforgettable moments in the film, as Chakalev turns in for bed one windy night on an empty beach, then awakens to a cabin surrounded by walruses as far as the eye can see.
We've been capturing stories from the Arctic for most of our careers as a photographer and as a filmmaker. One of the trips brought us to Chukotka, and we discovered this incredible story of Maxim Chakalev, and we just thought that this has to be a film. We have to tell this story.
That's Evgenia Arbugaeva. She shot Haulout with her brother, Maxim Arbugaev. The sister-brother team spent the months of September and October 2020 with Chakalev in the tiny hut from which he monitors the haulouts each fall as temperatures drop and the walruses make their way south from the Chukchi Sea down past the Bering Strait. The film captures the devastating impact of climate change for sure, but it also captures what it feels like to do science in an extreme environment. For WCS Temperate Asia Regional Director Jonathan Slaght, it felt very familiar. John's multi-year study of the Blakiston fish owl in the frigid forests of the Russian Far East was captured in his award-winning book, Owls of the Eastern Ice.
I've been in hundreds, probably, of Russian cabins throughout the 25 years I've been living or working in the Russian Far East, and they all look the same. The cabin in this film, it's an authentic cabin. He's sitting there eating fish out of a can. You can almost see the dirt in the grime and the cracks of his fingers. And so that was all. That's what first attracted me to the film, was the clear authenticity. There was nothing false.
A large part of the film's effectiveness is the result of a decision made in post-production not to impose a voiceover narration. The filmmakers have distilled some 60 hours of footage to a 25-minute frame in which we eat, sleep, and observe with Maxim Chakalev over the course of his season with the walrus. Evgenia Arbugaeva explains.
For us, it was very important to capture the atmosphere and the power of elements in the Arctic, the wind, the sea, the tundra, and all of these elements can speak for themselves through sound. We also wanted to give a chance to a viewer to go on this emotional journey with the protagonist and without being kind of guided too much or having too much messaging in the film. It's already a very strong story, and I think it becomes even stronger when you leaf through it on your own as a viewer.
A critical part of that story is what happens when tens of thousands of walrus gather together in such dense packs. They're easily spooked, and when disturbed, there's a tendency to stampede. The stampedes leave the smaller and weaker animals vulnerable to smothering and suffocation.
They're very easily scared of all the unfamiliar noises and unfamiliar smells. So when they were very close to the hut, we couldn't use a generator because it produces noise and it scares them. And once animals that are close to the hut get scared, they kind of send this wave of panic to the whole Haulout.
Toward the end of the film, the walruses have retreated into the sea, and Maxim Chakalev exits his hut to survey the damage. Dozens of walrus, mostly females and cubs, lie dead on the beach, victims of hunger and stampede. One baby walrus appears to have died beside its mother, only to move suddenly and head for the ocean. The knowledge that the young walrus will certainly not survive leaves the viewer with a kind of heartbreak. And yet Martin Robards sees a positive reading in the Haulout phenomenon so starkly depicted in the film.
The worst news would have been that the animals could not learn how to do something different. They would have just drowned out there in the ocean, and that would have been at the end of the story. That would have been really sad. But walruses have learned to come to land. We're not going to get more sea ice back again, even if we stop climate change right now for 1,000 years. It will not return to the state of sea ice that was in place when I came to Alaska some decades ago. The question now is, can we learn to help walrus live on land? Can we avoid those things that cause them to stampede and have these large mortalities?
Another important takeaway from the film for John Slaght is the importance of long-term commitment to a given place when doing scientific research, something that's hardwired into how Wildlife Conservation Society scientists tend to approach their work around the globe.
There's a scene in the film where he goes out and digs into this big pile of coal, puts it in his little bucket, takes it into the house, and starts his fire. And for me, the idea of that pile of coal even being there, it speaks to the long-term scientific commitment to the site. Somebody brought that there and put it there in front of the cabin so the cabin had its heat source, right? Because this is the Arctic. There's no trees. They can't start a wood fire. It shows that there's been a long-term commitment of scientific interest in this site and monitoring the walrus. And we wouldn't know that there were these 90,000 walrus this year, and that's an anomaly if there hadn't been the decade of prior or even longer research going into it.
If Maxim Chakalev is a representative of scientific inquiry for John Slaght, for Evgenia he has another role, conferred upon him by villagers in the nearby Chukchi town of Ermino.
In the village, some people call him Haulout keeper, because back in the day when walruses would haul out, of course in much smaller numbers, just in maybe 1,000 or even less, the spiritual leader, shaman of the community would go and also live near walruses to make sure that people don't hunt them and don't disturb them. They hunt them only in the water. They never hunt them when they're hauling out. So now Maxim is this modern day Haulout keeper.
Haulout screens at the Real Wild New York Film Festival in Manhattan on Friday, April 4th at 6 p.m. at the Lincoln Square 13 Movie Complex. Look for the link to buy tickets in the theater description for this podcast episode. For WCS Wild Audio, this is Nat Moss.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Nat Moss, with help from Dan Rosen and Hannah Kaplan. The WCS Wild Audio Podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Stay tuned for our next episode, and don't forget to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts.